हो गया हो गया हो गया हो गया अस्सलाम वालेकुम I am Dr. Faisal. I hope you are all happy, healthy, and safe in your houses. And I hope you can all hear me. This is accustomed to this, but to reach you as much as I can. Hello. Issue with the speed of the internet here in the library. Okay. The topic that we are going to talk about today is upper limb pathologies. For those of you who have been to our ward in the attachments in the last couple of months, they um, have had this lecture given to them. It's a very interesting bunch of disorders which you see every day, and none of them is deadly, disabling, or people suffer too much from them. These are one of those these are those common disorders that we all suffer from ourselves. Your father must ask you, your brother would ask you. For these little discomforting problems, which are frequently seen in physically active people. And there are some problems around the shoulder which are rarely seen. We'll talk a little bit about them, a few of those around the elbow, a few words about the common problems seen in the hands. The importance of you would be able to get some and you are able to lucky to see these problems. These will make your basis for understanding other disorders on comparative basis. Simple shoulder problems, among the shoulder problems, a very common disorder is the subacromial bursitis or the frozen shoulder. If you can get a concept today, what is the difference between the two, then you would be able to understand other disorders on comparative basis. Because no doctor in his life would see all the disorders, he would see some of them. These are the basic, these are the undergraduate days when you are going to make concepts about some common disorders. And when you are going to see a wide variety of problems in your clinical life, you would be able to compare these problems understood. So whatever disease you study, first of all, in your undergraduate days, the concept that we make today, they will remain with us. So let's go to the first slide. If you see the slide in the picture in the middle, the moving shoulder, this is a view of the shoulder from the back. And you see that up to the about 80-90 degrees of abduction, the humerus glides in the scapular glenoid cavity, and this movement is aided by deltoid, and from then onwards these rotator cuff muscles take over and they help and aid in abducting it. And from then onward, the shoulder movements are not exactly these the humeroglenoid movements. It becomes a scapulothoracic movement. From then on, this degree onwards, the scapula starts moving. So it's a complex movement to understand, and certainly far, far beyond your scope. Nobody is going to punish you if you don't understand this. But I have made this animation, brought this animation to your attention because this is where we get some concept that there are two components of movements in the shoulder. One are between the humerus and scapula, and the other is the scapular movements over the shoulder. The picture on the left corner, this is how the arthroscope is entered into the shoulder, because arthroscopy has become shoulder being a very superficial joint and lying right under the skin, easy to approach, is commonly used accessed through an arthroscope. An arthroscope is a small telescopic device that you see here that is inserted into the joint, and this probe goes in from the other side, and this is the irrigation fluid. So light and the probe and the scope, we all make 2-3 entries into them, and with those small holes we can enter into the shoulder and see. If you see the middle blackish picture in the middle, this is the arthroscopic view of the shoulder, and the shoulder is being seen through the scope from inside. And the basic purpose of showing you these pictures is to give you some idea of the anatomic facts, the restraints, the limitations. This is another slide. You see the picture on the left top corner, where we are showing some movement of the shoulder. And if you see the shoulder movements, you must understand that the clavicle doesn't really move a lot from its place when the shoulder moves. And most of the movement is between the head of the humerus and the scapula. This is a normal X-ray in the middle of the same shoulder. And if you see, this is the head, this area, the small area, this is the glenoid articulating with the humerus, head of humerus. This is the clavicle going to the other side. This is the acromion of the scapula, and the acromioclavicular joint is showing arthritis in this picture. You see these small osteophytes going down, and this is the normal joint. There are no osteophytes. On the right side, you see an MR or the MRI of the shoulder, and there is a void on the top of the shoulder, on the head, over the head of the humerus. This void is the torn rotator cuff. So these are common investigations, and these are common findings that we see in these investigations, just to give you some idea that how to use these investigations if needed. The first disorder that we see very commonly is the painful arch syndrome. There are many other names: rotator cuff tendinitis, partial tear rotator cuff, painful arch syndrome, mid-arch syndrome, impingement syndrome, or rotator cuff bursitis. There are many names for this. If I go back, you see this small space between the head of humerus and the acromion. This space is not part of the shoulder joint, but it lies outside, because if you see, the rotator cuff winds around the top of the head of humerus under the acromion. A painful arch syndrome is basically the inflammation of a small bursa under the acromioclavicular joint and lying in the potential space between the head of the humerus and the acromioclavicular joint. This commonly happens when we work above shoulder level, overhead, and our hand is working, or we are moving in front, using our hand for long hours or long durations in the forward flexion internal rotation or extreme abduction ranges. Because at that time, the shoulder, you see this is the impingement. This part in this comes under the tuberosity of the head of humerus. It impinges under the acromion. Because of that pressure, the typical patient would come to you with pain in the shoulder, either during work or during sleeping hours, that I cannot sleep on that side or I cannot sleep on the other side as well. Because as I try to put my shoulder uh, in and around the pillow, it becomes painful. The position of rest or the pain-free position is very difficult to find. Or if he's moving during the day, up to 60 degrees, the green part, there is no pain. Up to 60 to 120 degrees abduction, there is pain. And above, going up to the shoulder level, there's still no pain. And in the last part, there may be some pain. So this mid part, between 20 and 60 degrees of abduction, there is pain. So that's why we call it painful arc syndrome or a mid-arc syndrome. This tendinitis is non-specific, and because of overuse. Overuse is a term that we use in orthopedics commonly, which means that we are doing an activity which we are not accustomed to. We are not trained to do it. If I change my profession today and I have to go and do some heavy work, I'm not trained for that, and my body would need to adapt to it. So this kind of changes, and they commonly lead to fatigue, inflammation, minor tears in the muscles or muscular tendinous units, or the muscular attachments to the bones. These mild inflammations are non-specific. They're not caused by infective processes or inflammatory disorders like rheumatoid arthritis, but they are painful. These are transitory inflammatory disorders, and they would go away by themselves. Or if given some rest or some non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, they would bring relief. So most of these disorders, the painful arc syndrome, the painful elbows, and some other epicondylitises that we are going to talk about in some time, most of them would need some massage, some painkiller, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and sometimes some physical therapy like heat or cold, and they would resolve by themselves. If they are resistant and they don't respond to these measures, we may need to add some local steroid depot preparations. We inject them locally, and those steroids work as anti-inflammatories, and the inflammation goes away, so does the pain. These kind of disorders are not disabling. They don't destroy the joint. You can't find much in the x-rays. The only thing that you can find is small physical findings seen close on careful examination. Otherwise, there is no clinical finding either. Some of these patients, if you don't treat them with the rotator cuff tendinitis or painful arc syndrome, the inflammation in younger patients doesn't really lead to tears. But in older patients, if there is a persistent inflammatory process going on above the rotator cuff, and the rotator cuff is already ischemic due to chronic arterial insufficiency, atherosclerosis. So, with minor injuries, these cuff may become either partially torn. If you see this, only inflammation in this critical zone, and partial tear. And if you see the last right-sided picture, there may be full tears, and they may become rounded and chronic and displaced and distracted and whatnot. But these are all shades of one picture. When you see the patient, matters if you see him early, You may find him with an acute inflammatory phase, or if you see him after some time, the partial tear has set in. It's after some time, and you fail to treat him, there will be complete tear, and in another few weeks, months' time, that tear would become chronic. And if you see the middle picture, this gentleman is trying to abduct the shoulder. He can only abduct it by the scapular movements, not by the pectoral muscles or rotator cuff muscles, because they are if you see the MRI here, they are discontinuous. So these patients with rotator cuff tendinitis or inflammatory disorders may ultimately end up in a rotator cuff tear. The treatment is to operate it, and most of the operations, if you are not repairing it, may be needed to reduce the pain. If the pain needs to be reduced, we may need to do an arthroscopic debridement. The acromioclar joint, if you see the picture on the right side, I'm moving my cursor over there. The osteophytes and on the undersurface of the acromioclavicular joint are shaved off by the arthroscope. And sometimes the muscle need to be, especially in young patients, the muscle may need to be repaired. In that case, a more extensive open procedure is normally done. In some centers where the arthroscopic facilities are better, they are fixed through an arthroscope also. But it's a complex operation, rarely done, rewarding in a way, but difficult to produce predictably good results. This is another disorder. If you see the picture on the right side, what do you see? You can see the biceps, the deltoid, and there's small ecchymosis on the outside of the arm. This was a soldier. He came and he said, during drill, I just jumped with the gun in my hand and I fell on the ground. And when I got up, there was pain in my left arm. And I couldn't really work very well with my arm because of pain. He went home, and by the evening, he noted this swelling and ecchymosis on the outside. If you see this patient in comparison with the other side, the biceps mound or the swelling is lying far below where it should be. The long head of the biceps has broken or given way from the attachment over the glenoid. This does happen in young people during activities. The treatment is mostly symptomatic, and we don't really repair it, because the other head of the biceps is holding, and the patient can retrain himself. If needed, it has to be repaired open. This is the same what I told you. If you see this picture of this little, I hope you can all see this, of this cute little girl. She's only 4 years old. Mother has brought her that the right shoulder lies above as compared to the level of the left shoulder, and the neck is very unsightly when seen from the front and the back, and she looks crooked while she is pressed up to, and she plays with the girls. They make fun of her. Her right shoulder is at a higher level than the left shoulder. The reason being, if you see the picture closely, this here lies the scapula. This is the scapula. I wish I could make lines here. And this is the scapula on the right side, left side. The right side lies higher, a lot higher than the left side. What actually happens is the scapula develops at a higher level during intrauterine life, and it descends to its normal level before birth. And sometimes this descent is arrested by a fibrous cord between the spine and the scapular margin, the scapula or the cervical spine. Sometimes there's a bony spur as well. Malformations in the cervical vertebrae may also be seen. So this disorder is called a Sprangel's shoulder. Sprangel's shoulder is not an uncommon disorder, but not very frequent. You would get to see these patients sometime in your life. And the good part of the story is, in childhood, if they come early, this scapula can be brought down. All the muscles are under general anesthesia, all the muscles around the scapula are cut away. The scapula is brought down and anchored to the spine, and the muscles or which had been cut away are stitched to new attachments in the scapula. And after recovery, they get good results. The problem with these strangled shoulders is they don't come early in our country. They always come very late. By the time they come, the girl is already. Can you hold on a minute, please? Sorry, I was losing some battery in the. I was losing some battery, so I attached the charger. Okay, and if they, because most of these girls are brought to the outdoors very late, they are already menstruating, they're 14, 15 years of age. By that time, it's very difficult to undertake such a major surgery, because once you pull the scapula down and bring it down to the normal place, the brachial plexus gets compressed, and there can be devastating results. The arm may lose its function, and a lot of symptoms can occur. Vascularity even may suffer. So in adults or in mature skeletons, we simply excise the upper end of the supraspinal part of the scapula and remove that bone only. The muscles are by themselves would get attached to the older scapular margins, or they're stitched there. The shoulder level apparently would become equal. It's cosmetically good. The functional results are very nice, but it's seen closely, the scapula doesn't go back to its own position. So I've included only this picture only to give you some idea how to look at the X-rays of the dislocated shoulder. To give you some idea, because from here onwards we are going to talk about the chronic disabilities or chronic instabilities of the shoulder. Just to give you some idea, how do chronic instabilities occur. This is a normal, if you see in the pictures on the right side, a grounded looking head of the humerus. But this part, the tuberosities are not visible. They look like an hollow bulb. A is without that shadow of the bulb. If you impose a hollow bulb over it, so the scapula humerus looks like a hollow bulb. This is posterior dislocation of the shoulder. You see the picture on the in C and D. These are lateral views where you see a chronically dislocated shoulder, and the head of humerus has got a big crater in it. It has already been crushed multiple times, and this head of the humerus, which may not be apparent in the AP views, becomes very um, unstable and tends to redislocate again and again and again. So just to give you some idea how to look at these pictures. These are now we're going to talk about traumatic, recurrent traumatic instability. The typical history is the young patient has presented with history of dislocation, not once, many times. And especially if it's more than 4 times in 2 years' time, then we call it recurrent or dislocation of the shoulder or instability. And I can see Sabah Ulfat is probably roaming in the bazaar somewhere, shopping somewhere, and she's got the telephone video open. Am I true? Am I right? I wonder if she's attending the lecture or not. Okay, let's get back to our lectures. These shoulders would come with recurrent history of dislocation. If you examine them, the left picture on the left corner, upper corner, is the man is lying on the back and you're trying to abduct and external rotate of the shoulder and stabilize the scapula with the other hand. As you externally rotate this arm and push it interiorly, he stops. He becomes apprehensive that the shoulder will dislocate. So this is the apprehension sign. If you see it closely, this is the detached part. With an MRI, you see this detached part, which we call it Hill-Sachs-Lien. If you see them in a drawing, these are the, Bankart-Lien, sorry, not Hill-Sachs. Hill-Sachs is the X-ray picture. These are the possible injuries in the soft tissues, in the shoulder, the attachment to the glenoid. These are the way it can get attached. And these are, when there is recurrent dislocation of the shoulder, instability, which it can be confirmed on an ultrasound or an MR and by an X-ray in Hill-Sachs-Lien in the normal X-rays. What the treatment is, number one, avoidance of the unstable positions like overhead throwing or like and avoidance of external rotation, abduction simultaneously, steering muscle exercises. But if you need, some people will respond to that, and some people, especially those who get so frequent dislocation that it dislocates while it's sleeping and becomes so unstable, we treat it by strengthening or repairing the interior Bankart-Lien or reinforcing the anterior capsule, or sometimes making bony osteotomies to stabilize the shoulder. The results are at best modest in some cases, especially those with instability and very deformable joints. Frozen shoulder is a very common disorder that you see in mostly in older patients. Younger people don't come really with it. The diabetics, those who have suffered a bout of ischemic heart disease, angina, cardiac surgery, or some minor trauma. These people lose the ability to abduct the shoulder above the shoulder level, and they come with, if you see them closely, the rotation of the shoulder, glenohumeral joint is gone, especially the internal rotation is very limited, and the ability to abduct above the shoulder level is, disability is there. These patients, the X-rays are normal. There's no other local finding. There is no increased ESR or total leukocyte count. There's no inflammatory disorder. The treatment lies, since it is a temporary disorder, the treatment lies in pain relief, physiotherapy, and there are steroids can be injected locally. The patient must be encouraged to actively use the shoulder, and sometimes a surgical release can be achieved by giving general anesthesia and injecting steroid in the joint, and the joint is physically moved through all the range gently in the operation theater. It's a 5-minute procedure. Since the patient is relieved of pain, and we gently, when we move the shoulder in the the humerus in the glenoid, the adhesive capsule breaks away from the shoulder. The adherence break and the patient gains this range of motion. From then onwards, if he does some physiotherapy or keeps it moving, it doesn't really get attacked. This is a very interesting picture because your book includes these concepts. So I've just added this picture here so that you understand what is What are we talking about? If you see the picture on the right, in the middle, the lower middle, you see a metallic object fixed into the humerus. This is a partial joint replacement. When the head of humerus is fractured, and it is not a very infrequent injury, sometimes it gets fractured into a very comminuted bag of bones. If you try to fix it during surgery, you can't really put back the shoulder in its place. In that case, we call it a four-part fracture. If it is too displaced, too angulated, we simply remove those fragments and fix it, and a prosthetic metallic prosthesis into the joint, into the humerus. And there is a big stem which we push into the proximal humerus, and there is a head which articulates with the glenoid. And the abductors are stitched to the greater tuberosity. It's not a good replacement. The results are not very good. A lot of range of motion is never returned because the rotator cuff attachment to the proximal humerus is practically lost. But it is a good spacer. It becomes pain-free. The patient becomes passive range of motion is not bad. If you see the picture above, this is a total replacement of the shoulder joint. The glenoid is cut away because if you see the lower picture, there is white sclerotic margin in the glenoid. In that case, it is already arthritic. So you cut away the glenoid, add the fix another type of metallic process into the proximal humerus, attach the abductors to these threaded holes in the prosthesis. The results of total replacement of shoulder are better than hemi replacements, but the point lies with the attachment of the abductors. To reattach abductors to such a shoulder is not very easy and not very rewarding. Full range of motion is never actually achieved. And there is a reverse shoulder arthroplasty also being done. The head is attached to the glenoid part, and the small glenoid cavity is attached to the humerus. People have got good results with that, but it is still short of normal joint. This is an arthro disease. You see the glenoid and the head have already been chiseled away, and the bone-to-bone contact has been made. A plate is holding the proximal humerus to the clavicle, and acromioclar joint has also been excised. And if you fix this like this and keep it in immobilized, this joint will become stable. It is better than so many other conditions because there's no movement, but heavy work can be done. Now we come to the elbow. Elbow normally comes with trauma in adults or sequelae of trauma. Minor trauma would lead to minor presentations like tennis elbow. If you see the list, tennis elbow, golfer elbow, olecranon bursitis, or things like that. But the chronic disorders, tardy ulnar palsy, rheumatoid arthritis, loose bodies, or the Panner's osteochondritis, they are all seen, and the differential diagnosis becomes a little tricky sometimes. Although these are not very common disorders, nobody would punish you for not being able to find Panner's osteochondritis. But if you don't tell the examiner what is a tennis elbow or a golfer's elbow or olecranon bursitis, that is probably not going to be good for your examination. See the first picture on the top left, the olecranon bursa is swollen. It lies above the olecranon level. Sometimes it is inflamed and acutely infected. Otherwise, it's just the result of small frictional inflammation of the olecranon bursa at the tip of the olecranon, self-limiting, or maybe resolved with rest and compressions and non-steroidal inflammatories, or aspiration and injection of steroids locally. The next picture towards right is the Panner's osteochondritis. The cartilage and the subchondral bone gets avulsed from the lower humerus, opposite the head of radius, It is a disabling disorder, but very, very, very infrequent, not really seen commonly. The right side picture shows an already dislocated, destroyed joint because of old chronic infective or inflammatory disorder. The proximal ulna has been excised, proximal radius has been excised, the joint, the lower humerus has already lost its contour for these bones. It's an unstable elbow, but this is an axial arthroplasty sort of picture. The picture on the at the bottom of the screen, this is the myositis ossificans or loose bodies. Sometimes they can also present like this after trauma or disease. If you look at these moving pictures, look at this girl playing a backhand of the tennis, and if she's going to right, look at the right elbow, the wrist extensors are going to take the jerk or the pain or the physical cause. If you see this white picture, the picture in the middle, the lateral epicondyle gets inflamed, and the inflammation lies slightly distal to the epicondyle. The extensors get inflamed. These patients get tennis elbow. A similar mechanism can occur in the golfer's elbow, see in the right side. The medial epicondyle gets inflamed because they all occur because too much exercise has been done in a very short time, or the grip has changed, or the strokes have changed, or the game has been changed. So these are temporary disorders of tennis elbow and golfer's elbow, not typically occurring in tennis players and golfers. They are mostly seen in household people. And too much use of mouse keeps the rest extended. The maid or the lady of the house is cooking a large pot of meals for the family and has to use the right hand for rotating against pressure. So she can lead to tennis elbow. So similarly, we can induce by these disorders. The treatment is rest, and in local compression applications, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, sometimes steroid injections. If you look at the picture in this slide, I hope you're all seeing it. See the intermetatarsal spaces in the left hand. They're all deep. See, the first web space is also very deep. What is happening is that there is an ulnar nerve compression in this patient, and it's been of long standing, and because of this compression, the adductors or the interossei have already atrophied, and this atrophy has deepened the intermetacarpal distances. And so whenever there's going to be a nerve entrapment and nerve compression, the muscles attached to supplied by that nerve will become atrophic. The skin will become thin and irritable and dry. So you see the skin on the left side and the right side. There's a difference between dry and scaly. The treatment of ulnar nerve compression is decompression of wherever there is compression, like because of trauma, or if the Gyan tunnel is compressing, or some muscle passing over the ulnar nerve is, or sometimes secondary to elbow surgery, the slow onset of chronic ulnar nerve dysfunction. The typical presentation is numbness of the medial three fingers, atrophy of the adductor of the shoulder, of the thumb, or the intermetacarpal dorsal interossei, they become the treatment, the diagnosis lies in taking a proper history, making a clinical examination, and after finding these atrophic changes and numbness and dryness in this corresponding area of the ulnar nerve, you go on to make a Froment test. A Froment test basically shows us that the patient's adductor is already weak. If you see the picture in the middle, and if you to ask him to hold a card or two papers and hold on to it while you tug it away or pull it away, the interphalangeal joint of the left thumb will become flexed because since adductor is not working, to keep that paper in his hand or to pull the paper away or to resist with the paper being pulled away, he will start flexing the long flexor of the thumb because the local adductors are not working. It's called a Froment sign. Once it is positive, it shows that the ulnar nerve is not working. The treatment is avoidance of compression and positions where the compression may occur at night or during work or use of splints. Sometimes it may need to be released and transport surgically. This is probably we can leave this slide also just to give you some idea where does the triangular fibrocartilage lie. The book talks about triangular fibrocartilage injuries in the, so I just made this slide only to show you, see this white area in this MRI at the distal ulna, that space between the ulnar styloid and the lower radius. This area is held by triangular fibrocartilage. Wrist injuries can lead to its inflammation and swelling. Otherwise, there is no importance for you. You can even leave it alone. I have added this picture on purpose because I just wanted to show you how do rheumatoid deformities begin. Treatment of rheumatoid arthritis in acute inflammatory stage or without fixed deformities or joint destructions, rheumatoid is the basically domain of the physician to treat or the rheumatologist. It's not the domain of the orthopedic surgeon. But of course, since these deformities come to us, I just wanted to give you some idea how do these deformities and destructions begin. If you see a rheumatoid hand can present with pain and swelling of the interphalangeal joints in symmetrical manner, both hands, both sides of the body, including the elbow, the knees, the shoulders, hands starting together, accompanied with a lot of morning stiffness. The stiffness would be there for half an hour before the patient can work. The typical stiffness, presentation of swellings in the small joints, but particularly the proximal interphalangeal joints and the metacarpophalangeal joints. DIPs are rarely involved, distal interphalangeals, and the typical swelling begins on the over the ulnar styloid. If you see this in this area, the middle picture above, the typical swelling starts here, erodes the intercollateral ligament, and the wrist moves into radial deviation. Boutonnieres and swan neck deformities can occur because of the loss of attachments of the interphalange of the extensor tendons. So the powerful flexors would deform the finger into swan neck or boutonnieres deformity. Sometimes these patients would come to you with Z deformities. The fingers have ulnar deviated, the wrist and the hand has radial deviation, and then you see the corpus also radiating ulnarwards after the words. Some cases, if you see the middle picture, this is arthroplasty or exchange of the lower end of radius, attachment of a metallic part, the plastic part in the distal fragment. It maintains some range of motion, some stability, but it's not a good result, as good as is in total knee or total hip replacements. I hope you are not bored and you are not tired. I've got three more slides. This is Dupuytren's contracture. I just included this picture to show you. I'm actually trying to make up for lack of clinical cases and give you some ideas where to look for the disorder. This is a middle-aged person normally with my background of some medical condition like he's on epileptics or phenytoin or he's on is an alcoholic or a cirrhotic or some CA or some chronic inflammatory disorder. He says there's puckering of see the picture on the right side, the puckering of the palmar crease or the palmar skin becomes adherent to the structure underneath. Generally a thick fibrous tissue forms between the palmar fascia and the skin. These deformities start interfering with the movements of the fingers. So deforming the fingers to so severe that the movements become, it's generally a very slow process, takes over years, into flexion, and even the hygiene of the hand cannot be maintained, plus loss of function. The treatment is inflammation and anti-inflammatory disorders, physical therapy, local steroid injections, but the best treatment is probably to go in and excise these fibrous bands, the contracting fibrous palmar fascia bands. A trigger digit is the interference of movements of the fingers or the thumb between the long flexor and the small and the short flexor, or the profundus or the superficialis flexors of the fingers. Basically, these flexion disorders are temporary or very short. They this inflammation causes tightening of the tunnel from which under which the long flexor and short flexor or profundus and superficialis are passing at A1 pulley. So the tendon gets entrapped into it while during movements. What the patient would say to you is that when we are flexing the finger, it stops short of complete flexion. There's pain, and with force, it will get completely flexed, but then it would not release to get extended. So it's basically a trigger mechanism, mostly seen in children in congenital form when the thumb gets it. The treatment is rest, local inflammatories, or injections, and in some of these patients is under local anesthesia that constricting synovial lining is excised or incised. It's a very good treatment. It's self-limiting. Equorvians is the inflammation of the extensor and abductor of the thumb. There's pain over the radial styloid. It's a temporary problem, but mostly people who are into doing a lot of knitting or usage of hand of the thumb in scissors, or surgeons like us, they also have suffered sometimes because of this. So it's basically the pain is over the radial styloid, increases with work, and provocative tests or the stretching tests of the wrist, they are done, and the pain returns. So it's called de Quervain disease. It is treated in the same manner like other disorders. Flexor tendon sheath infections once occur in the hand, they will go to the wrist as the lining does. And this is carpal tunnel syndrome, median nerve compression, and it occurs at the level of the wrist, and because of the tight flexor retinaculum. The treatment is pain relief, splint at night, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and such treatment. Very rarely is surgical decompression required. Rest and physical therapy work very well with them. This is chondritis of the shoulder. You see pictures of this in your book. You can see it, read it better from there. So what is this going on? This is the last slide, and then I'll seek your permission to leave. If you look at this wrist, it is the left wrist of a girl, probably from your class or the class before that. There is a swelling on the dorsum of the left wrist. It says a young female presents with firm part swelling dorsum right wrist for the last 1 month. What could it be? Can you guys write here? Oh, this girl is so smart. Yes, it's a ganglion. It's a ganglion. It's basically a small synovial swelling on the dorsum of the foot, self-limiting. Most of times it would burst by itself, And otherwise we just treat it with non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, a bit of compression, and sometimes we aspirate and take out the gel-like fluid and inject steroids. It's a very rewarding procedure, and the patient gets treated. I think I've just kept the chat open because I want to know, did the talk help or did it get through to you very well? Because on my side, I have finished and I've presented what I wanted to. But I just want to know your feedback. Kindly write a few words here if it's been helpful or if there has been some problem with sound or if I was not good enough, was too fast, too slow. Kindly give me a feedback. Patellar bursitis. बेटे जफर ये this is dorsum of the wrist. It's not knee. I'm sorry, the picture is not very good. That's why I told you it is the dorsum of the wrist. It's not. I'm not talking about the knee. We're talking about the wrist. They're so common. You will see. I mean, अब तक आप लोगों को आपकी फैमिली पूछ चुकी होगी कि मेरे wrist पे यार swelling होगी, इसका क्या वजह है? इतना common है this ganglion, wrist ganglion, that you must have treated some by now. Patellar bursitis is also like that, but it's a large swelling and it's softer. It's not so tense and hard like ganglion cyst. But the reason being the ganglion cyst arises from deep around the scaphoid, somewhere deep in the wrist. And the balloon rises to under the skin on the dorsum of the wrist. And that balloon is filled with very thick synovial fluid. Most of the water is reabsorbed and it's thick and hard and painful. Patellar bursitis is also painful, but it's a lot softer than a ganglion cyst. Anything else? Zafar, am I clear? Did you understand what I told you? Oh, thank you, Zafar. Anybody else wanting to ask anything? Actually, you are a very large group. You are about 150 people. So it's very difficult. Otherwise, I would have preferred to keep the video open that you should see me. And if I could see some of you, at least that's what's happening to my kids, where there are about 50 or 30 people group. The teacher insists that I must see all of your videos. But I feel sort of blind talking from this end. Okay, best of luck. Thank you very much. You've been a very patient group. Let's hope we start teaching normally again soon. Allah आप सबको महफूज रखे बेटे. Thank you very much.